So big news coming out that I'm sure you're just hearing about, which is that India and China have agreed on a patrolling deal that will presumably diffuse tensions and perhaps even end the border crisis that India and China have seen on their northern boundary over the last 4 years. A truly interesting development that has taken place with Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri just announcing this development an hour ago. Joining us now is one of India's finest China experts, Professor Jabin Jacob. Professor Jacob, could I ask you to begin with your initial reactions? Could you tell us what exactly the Foreign Secretary said, as well as your sense of what this deal will involve?
Well, the first thing is that this is one step in a larger deal. Looking at the Foreign Secretary's remarks, he said that the arrangement on border patrolling will lead to disengagement and eventually to a resolution of the issues from 2020. So I think we have to, place the deal in the context of the larger question, which is of disengagement and de-escalation. So the border patrolling is only about, I think, dealing with the issues that arose from the fact that many people in India understood that, the original deal on border patrolling would lead to buffer zones. I mean, the fact that both sides would not patrol would lead to a buffer zone, and essentially that was a situation that was unacceptable to India. So I think this is a repairing of that particular notion. But we still have to figure out, we still have to know what exactly this border patrolling deal involves. I mean, are Indian troops going to be allowed to go back to the points that they used patrolled originally, or is there a different kind of a patrolling system that is going to be underway? So this is still not clear. And so what has to be clear is that this is neither disengagement nor de-escalation. Those are still steps that are a distance away.
Understood. So, if I could ask you again to just put it in the proper context, as you were mentioning, the Foreign Secretary, of course, saying that the patrolling deal, there is a patrolling deal that has been reached. Could you explain, if you could just begin with, in terms of the crisis that began in the middle of 2020, what exactly India's contentions were with Chinese actions in terms of blocking access to patrolling rights? If you could, in a very short way, just explain to our viewers what the genesis and the nub of the conflict was that led to this border crisis in the last 4 years.
So in 2020, of course, we had the escalation of Chinese activities on the LAC. The Chinese had come for their regular summer exercises during the COVID period, India had delayed in sending its troops up to the borders because of COVID. And it seems that the Chinese took advantage of this particular situation and made ingressions across a number of areas in East. Now, India was quick to respond, and we essentially had the situation where, after a series of clashes, Galwan took place, and lives were lost at the border for the first time in several decades. And that is really where we are at. We have had subsequently talks, several rounds of military to military talks, as well as diplomatic talks between the working mechanism on the two sides. And what has happened is, over time, there has been disengagement from several of the friction points, but not completely. What the Indian government has done, I believe, is bring into play some friction points that it had earlier termed as legacy issues, and had given the impression that it was not going to be looking at them. In fact, the foreign minister's statement some weeks ago about 75% of the problems being resolved, he had to clarify and say that 75% of the disengagement had taken place.
Right.
And the remaining 25%, I suppose, is what what we refer to as these legacy issues in Depsang and Demchok.
Right.
So right now, we are not looking at any of those. We are only talking about one of the agreements that we had made over time, was there would be buffer zones between the two sides to prevent further conflicts, to prevent conflict between the two patrolling sides. So patrolling would be stopped well behind their usual patrolling points. Now, this particular deal seems to be about perhaps restoring patrolling as per as was the case previously. But we don't know that yet. We have simply gotten a general phrase about a deal being achieved on border patrolling. We have to wait for the details.
Understood. Right. So you've talked about, of course, the restoration of patrolling rights as well, or at least reaching an agreement on border patrolling, and of course the possibility of disengaging. Could you explain that that pathway and that process? Where if I may quote him directly, he said, as a result of discussions that have taken place over the last several weeks, an agreement has been arrived on patrolling arrangements across the line of actual control in the India-China border area, and this is leading to disengagement and eventually a resolution of the issues that had arisen in these areas in 2020. So I'm sorry to ask you again to unpack this for us, for our viewers who may not be familiar with the intricacies as you are, which is a patrolling agreement would then, in particular areas where there are still friction areas where disengagement has not happened, would this naturally then lead to disengagement in these areas where Indian and Chinese troops have not yet disengaged?
So I'm not sure about that. You see, when the conflict broke out, our initial position was, we had to return to status quo ante. Now we are talking about, and then we started talking about disengagement and de-escalation. So de-escalation would mean return to status quo ante. But for the last several years, we've actually only been stuck at the disengagement process, and even that has not been complete. So what we are talking about right now in terms of a border patrolling deal is really even before disengagement. So we are quite a distance away from the restoration of status quo ante as it stood in the summer of 2020,
right,
before the Chinese transgressions. So I think it's too soon to say that disengagement is inevitable or will inevitably follow. I think there are a bunch of reasons not related to the border, but related perhaps to the economies, the state of economies of both countries, that are leading to this sort of movement. And this is, it's certainly progress, you could say, or an impression of progress, but it is really nowhere near what we would ideally like the situation to be, which is restoration of status quo ante.
right.
I think there is a certain amount of pressure for optics, perhaps, given that the BRICS summit is, coming up, and therefore, these sort of deals are timed in order to sort of give substance to these meetings.
I understand. And could you sort of lay out for us in terms of what India would like to see going forward, if you could explain? And then perhaps we'll also ask you very briefly about the intentions of both sides. We've seen, of course, economic troubles in China, what some of the motivations are for India. But if I could ask you to lay out now what this looks like exactly moving forward, if this were to move smoothly as, let's say, the government of India might hope or might expect. A patrolling deal has been achieved. There are, of course, parts of the northern sector where forces have disengaged, as you were mentioning earlier, and there are places where they have not yet disengaged. So could you explain how this patrolling deal, of course, you haven't, the details are not out yet, but how exactly this would work in areas where they have not disengaged, in areas where they've disengaged? What would it require? What would it need to be a successful deal? How does that lead to, let's say, a pathway towards restoration of status quo? If I could ask you to just lay out how this develops moving forward.
So I don't think in areas where disengagement has not happened, there's a question of resuming patrolling. It's the situation is pretty much live, as it were. I think patrolling, this particular deal only relates to those areas where some degree of disengagement has happened and where those buffer zones were in place. And now we will see, what exactly is likely to transpire in terms of whether there will be new patrolling points, whether there will be new patrolling patterns.
Sure.
I very much doubt that. I think pretty much the Indian side has always been, our position has always been that we need to return to the protocols that the Chinese violated before. And I think that is probably what is likely to happen, at least in these few areas where disengagement has happened. In terms of a timeline, I don't particularly, I'm not particularly optimistic that this is going to happen very quickly now. Even to get to this point, and which is well away from our basic requirement, I think it's taken us a long time. So I think we'll have to wait and watch in terms of what the general situation is. I mean, it's not just a situation on the border, like I mentioned before. It's a general geopolitical context, the domestic situation, the meetings that might be up and coming. All of those factors play a role in how um, well these deals happen,
Right.
or that these deals are promoted as deals.
Mm.
As of now, I think this is a very limited achievement.
Mhm.
I mean, there is some progress. One could say that, well, they are not at fisticuffs or coming to blows, but we have now to watch this patrolling agreement also very carefully to see
Right.
whether both sides, the Chinese side especially, given that it has a history of transgressions,
Mhm.
will follow now this agreement. And history says that the Chinese have ignored agreements whenever they found it convenient to ignore them.
Mhm.
So we'll have to wait and watch very carefully.
Understood. Could I also ask you a little bit about the motivations that, of course, I'm asking you, of course, right after this has been announced, but could I ask you a little bit about what you see as the motivations of both sides in perhaps agreeing to something like a patrolling deal, both from the Chinese side as well as from the Indian side?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question. Say again,
Yes,
please.
yes, of course. I wanted to ask you about in terms of the motivations and the strategic reasons that push, for example, China to agree to this sort of patrolling deal after 4 years of an impasse on this issue. Do you have a sense of why exactly China may have agreed to work on this patrolling deal?
So I think there are a bunch of reasons. One is the international context in which I mean, the world is increasingly turning hostile
Mhm.
towards China, both from an economic perspective as well as from a political perspective.
Mhm.
The U.S. elections are underway right now, and doesn't matter who comes to power, the Chinese are foreseeing a very difficult time in their relationship with the Americans.
Mhm.
So, and plus they've taken a lot of flack for their no limits partnership with the Russians in the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Right.
So I think there is this geopolitical blowback that the Chinese are trying to deal with, and one way they've always dealt with is through these protestations or these affectations of global South unity, BRICS unity, and so on and so forth. So for that purpose, India is an important partner, important player.
Mhm.
Then there is the domestic context in China where the economy is not doing too well. Uh, and China needs markets to open up. If the West is certainly not opening up, and the other option is really India. And we've seen this discussion or debate in India about how much India has to open up to China. And I suppose the Chinese are trying to take or make the most of this debate by giving up, by coming to some sort of a deal to give the impression that, well, things are moving along on the border, and therefore things can move along also on the economic front.
Right.
So I suppose those are the reasons that the Chinese are thinking of.
Understood. And of course, if I may ask you, in terms of a last question, what do you see as some of the potential obstacles or difficulties that both sides will have to work on in the weeks and months to come in terms of making this a practicable agreement that will lead to some of normalization in other parts of the relationship? You and I, of course, have talked about allowing Chinese investments into the Indian economy in particular sectors which Indian businesses asked for. So could I ask you in terms of what some of the obstacles might be towards the successful resolution of this crisis in the weeks and months ahead?
Look, I don't think we should be looking at obstacles. I mean, these as obstacles. I mean, these are Indian policies framed with great thought and care, based on Chinese actions and based on global experience.
Mm.
So, I mean, China has been a zero-sum player. It has adopted a mercantilist approach in its economic interactions, and therefore, all countries with the capacity are beginning to react to this.
Mm.
And India is not an exception. And what India has done in terms of keeping out Chinese investments or putting restrictions on Chinese investments have sort of, these policies are based on our own experiences. Chinese companies have been caught transferring funds illegally and not paying their taxes. So all of those are issues that the Chinese need to resolve if they are to be involved in the Indian market. And unlike in China, Indian courts will treat foreign companies and Indian companies equally. This is not the case in China. So where I mean, where India is an open player, it's open to globalization. China isn't, and therefore we need to be careful. We need to have our policies or restrictions, certain restrictions in place in order to avoid unfair competition or avoid undermining of our own industries, our strategic sectors by the Chinese. I mean, there are economic reasons, as I mentioned, but there are also security reasons. Questions of data privacy, data security, the openness with which Chinese, convey information to us, lack of transparency in Chinese companies, lack of Indian hiring in Chinese companies. Now, Chinese have actually started reacting to some of this, beginning to Indianize, their management, etc. But they need to do a lot more.
Mm.
So this is sort of ongoing. This is an ongoing process. But again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done even on this front.
Understood. Javin Jacob joining us to explain just the sense of this new border patrolling deal that seems to have been agreed between the Indian and Chinese sides. Limited progress, Professor Jacob says, but progress nonetheless. Thank you so much, Professor.